Hi, this is James Sayer, and this is The Breakdown. Welcome. This is episode number 22, and we're talking about genetic testing tonight. Specifically, we're going to be talking about genetic testing in regards to your genetic or ancestral history. So we're talking about genetic research regarding researching your genetic your actual genetic history through different companies. I actually got a genetic test a while ago from a company called CRI Genetics. It stands for Cellular Research Institute, and it's run. It has as their chief scientific officer. His name is Alexei Fedorov. He's a well-respected molecular geneticist who uses well over 500,000 different genetic markers to analyze your DNA. And this company, they use not only molecular geneticists and scientists, but they also use social scientists and anthropologists in their analysis. Obviously, the geneticists do the analysis of the genes and all the genetic markers, but they also use anthropologists to analyze migration patterns and different factors involved as far as like human migration and different behavior patterns from different peoples over time, and they can use their anthropological and historical knowledge to give you a richer and more fuller understanding of how different peoples came to be over time. So there's a lot to genetics. It's not just, there's a lot more to it than just researching your ancestry and finding out, the roots of where you came from, which is fascinating for sure. And we're going to get into that. But obviously, there's huge implications for scientific research as far as fighting disease, finding cures for illnesses, and things like that. And that we've only just begun to discover. They just finished mapping the human genome 18 years ago, just a little over 18 years. I think it was like the 14th was like the anniversary when they completed it back in 2003. So it's still in the early stages, but they've come a long way in a short time from what they've been able to derive from all this genetic research. And they're unlocking all kinds of new information about, the secrets locked inside of our genetic code and the things that make us more resistant to disease or more prone to a disease or more, more susceptible to certain types of behavior or more susceptible to, allergic reactions to this type of food or this type of chemical. There's medical, nutritional, scientific, just almost unimaginable wealth of possibilities that could come from genetic research, and we're still just in the early stages of it. So, and there are very serious implications too. There was just a story actually this past week from NPR regarding a recent article posted in the journal Cell about a recent experiment that was done where scientists successfully grew human stem cells inside a macaw monkey's embryo, and they were able to inject like 25 human stem cells into like a lot of different human monkey embryos, and they were, I think, in 132 of those monkey embryo samples that they used, they were able to grow human stem cells inside the embryo for at least 19 days. Now that's looked at as a very encouraging success. That they've tried similar experiments with other animals like sheep and cows and things like that, and they haven't had success growing stem cells inside embryos of these animals. But they did have success with the monkey because they're much more genetically similar to humans. So this is encouraging. They think this could lead to possibly a way to grow organs in the future for people. That's a major medical issue. There's not enough organs to go around for organ transplant. They think in the future they may be able to use this type of genetic research to be able to actually grow you new organs, potentially even new limbs. The possibilities even are endless. You could potentially, there's the whole cloning aspect, possibilities down the road that are legitimately possible. They sound outlandish and far-fetched, but they could become a possibility. As could the possibility that, like, if an experiment like what we're talking about somehow went wrong, you had an unethical geneticist or something, you could end up like with an experiment like we're talking about, potentially if done the wrong way, where you could have a monkey walking around with human sperm, or a monkey walking around with human eggs inside of her. Or you could have a human monkey or you have a monkey, right? But that ends up with some human brain cells inside of their brain, potentially creating a new species. Right? There's serious medical, bioethical ramifications here that have to be seriously taken into consideration and dealt with. The NIH currently has a ban on funding for this type of research for these reasons, and they are awaiting new guidance from the Society for, like, I can't remember the name of it, but for like molecular genetic research. Is supposed to put out. That's not the name of the group. I can't remember it, but they're putting out their guidance sometime within the next month or so, and NIH is going to take a look at that and then make their own determinations as far as whether they'll be willing to fund this type of research, which seems like it should be funded if there are very strict ethical, legal guidelines in place to make sure that unethical experimentation doesn't occur. That is a legitimate, serious concern. But that's not what this show is about. This show is actually about the ancestral side of it. I wanted to talk about that. Just to give you a more nuanced understanding. I know there's a lot of different companies out there that do offer these services, genetic testing services like 23andMe and ancestry.com, and they're legitimate. Though CRI Genetics makes the claim that they're much more accurate because of the number of genetic markers that they use to do their analysis and their advanced approach. Not only in their genetic analysis, but their use of anthropologists to look at all these other anthropological and historical factors that have impacted our genetic history. So let's get into that, because that's really interesting. And I know what you're thinking too, right? I took this genetic test, and I've been wanting to take this test ever since even before they finished mapping the human genome. I wanted to take a genetic test. I've always been fascinated by, just the question of origins of basically everything, with myself included. And so I've been waiting for a long time, but held off because of a basic form of paranoia, not wanting my genetic information to be out there. And I think that's actually a very reasonable fear. If you're concerned about having your genetic information out there and you're worried about it being stolen, you're not paranoid, because most of these companies, they do protect it. I know CRI claims to have a really good encryption service to protect your data, and I believe most of these companies do have special protections to protect your data. There's certainly a lot of legal implications for them if they don't, but nothing is foolproof, right? There's no system that can't be hacked. There's no data that can't be uncovered. There will need to be probably some better HIPAA laws put into place to make sure that our genetic information, as it becomes more available, as more genetic testing is done, that it is kept private, kept out of the hands of whoever might want to misuse that information, whether it's healthcare companies or insurance companies or just scammers who are willing to say or do anything to try and pry that money away from you, right? That we have to, our genetic information is as, personal and as private as, your personal business or your money, and should be protected as such. So we need to make sure going forward, because genetic research is not going away. There's just going to be more of it, because this is a gold mine for the future of like how we're going to be able to manage disease and manage health, right? And truly a sophisticated scientific approach. This is a big part of that moving forward, but we have to do it the right way. So if you're holding off, I don't blame you. And, I'm saying if you don't feel paranoid because you held off, because I did too. But finally, the curiosity just gave way. And I was like, you know what, the hell with it. If they're going to try and make an army, out of me, good luck. Good luck with that. I don't think that's going to happen. But, they're going to steal my information. They could do it. Possibly, but the curiosity just overwhelmed me. I had to find out. So I gave in. So let the chips fall where they may with the scammers as they play with my genetic code and, come up with some monstrous, some mad scientist comes up with a monstrous creation based off of my DNA and a monkey. Who knows? But hopefully that doesn't happen. Nonetheless, this was a great experiment. I really enjoyed it. I spent a few $100 and paid for some extra tests to get a full range. I didn't just you can get different types of tests depending on the package that you get with this company. You can get like a basic genetic like history of like the last 5 generations. Look at your family tree, basically genetic family tree from the last 5 generations. And that's kind of the basic. They have a more advanced report that they can do, a more detailed, advanced type of analysis that goes back well over 1,000 years, perhaps even as far as 50 generations. It's like 1,200 plus years, at least, to give you a more detailed analysis, a fuller, more robust picture of your genetic history, not just the last 5 generations. I got both of those, and they're interesting comparisons because they are different. Also, they can you can get information about the different traits and the genes that are a part of traits that you have, or the genes that you have that point to a certain probability of you having certain traits, not just traits like hair color or eye color or body odor, or whether you're susceptible to more susceptible to nicotine addiction, because there are genetic markers for things like that. And there's genetic markers to see if you're going to be good at math, or if you'll probably be good at math. Because most of these genetic markers, they determine a probability. They don't determine it with certainty. But these genetic markers, often they're like a protein that is associated with people that tend to do better at math, or a protein that's associated with people who are impulsive, or associated with people who are more dependent on nicotine. These are the genetic markers that they use to identify, the probabilities that you are related to this person, right? Or the probabilities that you could get this disease, or the probability that you're going to have a high BMI, these types of things, right? So they have all these different tests that you can use, right? There's like a health and wellness thing, a nutrition thing, an allergy thing, and they're all really fascinating and informational. And they're not all necessarily true. For example, I got, this isn't related to ancestry, but regarding like traits, it says, the high probability to have red hair. Well, I've never had red hair. It's mostly gray now. But when I was young, it was dark, very dark brown. So, there's probabilities, you get a 90% probability. There's still 10% chance that, you can end up not being that. That there's still, because of the way genes are, that there is a random variation every time, your parents reproduce, that you can have a very different genetic makeup from the rest of your family, right? Like they can all look very much the same. And you can be like the one oddball. That does happen where, and I am kind of like that in a way, uh, in some respects, where you have like one person, like a whole family of people who are lighter and darker, lighter, and then you got one person who's darker, right? Or everybody who's blonde, and one person who's got dark hair, right? Family, a bunch of tall people, which most of my family is tall. I'm not. I'm 5'9" if I stretch really good in the morning, at best, right? So it's like I'm an outlier there. Now, when I go to a family reunion, everybody's well over 6 feet. I don't look like I belong, but from the same family, from the same group, but slightly different genetic orientation, slightly different genetic mix, same line, right? But different genes. So even though like my brother and I come from the same parents, right? He gets 50% of their genes and I get 50%. Those 50% that we both get are very different, right? So that's the fascinating aspect about this. So anyway, on to the ancestry part. So I told you they do the basic 5 generation, analysis. That's the first thing they do. And so that's going back, 100, 120 years or so. So basically what they found, pretty consistent, and this is what they say too in their reports, is that this will probably be fairly consistent with what your grandparents have told you, which for the most part it was, which I knew it was going to be mostly German and English, Irish heritage, and some French, and so, with some Native American. That's what I was told, and so I knew, well, that's going to be a mix. I thought it was a pretty good diverse mix. But the five generation analysis actually revealed that not only am I predominantly of Germanic descent, about 41%, regarding the last 5 generations, but that I'm about 15% English, right? And then there's all these other groups: 10% Slavic, 8% Spanish, 8% Italian, 7% from Scandinavia, 2.5% from African Caribbean, so that's interesting. So 97.5% basically European, of one sort or another, whether it be there's Germanic, there's Slavic, there's Italian, there's Celtic, there's Spanish, right? There's all of that. It comes through right around like 97.5% European. But then the other 2.5% is African Caribbean, and so that's an interesting mixture of people from Africa, like 4 different groups basically from Africa, kind of evenly divided up. It's an interesting, distinct genetic mix for Afro-Caribbean people. They're a mixture of people from Benin and Nigeria and a couple other countries as well, and they all kind of intermingled in the Caribbean during the slave trade, and that's kind of how they have this unique genetic mix from being in the Caribbean during the slave trade, right? The Tainos were originally the natives, more like Native American peoples living on the Caribbean islands. They basically got wiped out by Columbus and his people, and they were brutal to them. They essentially killed them all off brutally, and then brought in the slaves from these different African countries, and these were the ancestors. These are some of my ancestors, at least make up 2.5% of my genetic makeup from the last 5 generations. Well, that's pretty. I had no idea about that. I had no idea. I thought, there might be, but didn't know, right? And I didn't know about Spanish. Didn't know about Italian. I had no idea about Slavic ancestry at all. It's fascinating. The other stuff I knew. So that's cool. All right, so that's the 5 to 5 generations. But then they did detailed analysis I paid extra for that goes back, like I said, can go back to about 50 generations. They didn't get 50 generations on me, but they got over 30. And they were able, so I think I listed off like, I don't know how many different ethnic groups I was a part of, like 8 or 9 maybe, from the 5 generation analysis, right? But when they do the more detailed, more advanced analysis of your genetic code, going back well over 1,000 years, it's a very different picture. Suddenly, I'm no longer 97.5% European. I'm about 90% European. My genetic makeup, because you're looking at it from a very different perspective. We're looking at things from well over 1,000 years versus over 100 years. So I'm about 90% European then, right? Similar makeup, right, of Germanic, Celtic tribes, Spanish, Italian, Slavic, but then also we have, right, the bit from Africa, right, the Afro-Caribbeans, the Afro-Caribbean folks that came from Africa originally, those ancestors. But then we also have a whole bunch of folks I didn't know anything about. I got ancestors from Peru. I've got one that goes back. It goes back over 800 years to about, around 1300. I can trace back. I had an ancestor from Peru that goes back that far. Now I know I had ancestors in Europe, going way, way, way back, and I had ancestors that were Normans that came from France and fought, fought the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Right, I knew that, but I had no idea I had ancestors from Peru. That I had ancestors from Colombia. These are small percentages, right? But they do add up, right? So there's about 4% of my genes from this, advanced analysis come from South America, whether that's Peru or Colombia, or I guess you'd say not necessarily South America, but also Puerto Rico and Mexico. But then there's about another 6% that comes from Asia. And that's a mix, right, of 2 different Han Chinese, Chinese Dai, Japanese, and Vietnamese as well, right? And also 2 different groups from India, right? Punjabi and Gujarati Indian, as well as Tamil and Bengali from Bangladesh. So I've got ancestors from like 18 different ethnic groups spread over the last 1,000 years or so. That I'm aware of, right? And they establish these. They have samples from different people from all over the world, genetic samples that they then test you against to find genetic markers. And they have those genetic samples, and they can say, you share a genetic marker with this person. That's how we know that you're descended from this person. And this, there's an ancestor of yours that was alive, 1,000 years ago, here in Peru. Or, 300 years ago, you had an ancestor in India. So I had no idea about any Asian heritage whatsoever, right? And that to me is fascinating. So yeah, basically from this more advanced point of view genetically, I'm 90% European, but kind of like 10% everybody else, which is pretty cool, I think, right? And I think that, to me, it kind of made me like, I don't know, it made me like more interested. I wanted to find out more about, who these people were, because I had no idea that they were part of my line, right? That they too make up part of who I am. And that makes me more curious about who they were and what they did, right? Because, let's face it. I mean, your ancestors led to you. Their sacrifice, their struggles, everything that they were and did led to you. And I guess in a way I want to honor them, but also to learn from them, right? Not just to say, hey, thanks for living and surviving and procreating and leading up to me, but to learn from them. Like what secrets and what lives did they live? Like I didn't even know these people were a part of my genetic family, and it gives me a much richer and deeper sense of myself, right? And I'm not just some white guy from America, which I obviously am, but it's not that simple, right? Because the truth is nobody's just a white guy or a white person or a black person, right? We're a mixed bag. We're a mixture. My story's not that unusual. I've talked to other people who've had genetic tests, and they've also been very surprised by the wide range of different ethnicities. They had no idea that they had in their genes. And look at it this way too. I'm just talking about the last 1,000 years, right? We know modern humans have existed for around 200 to 300,000 years, like in our current anatomical form, brain size, roughly about that for the last 200, 300,000 years. And we migrated out of Africa at different times along that point, right? So this leads to the next. I got two more tests. I got a bunch of tests, but they're pretty good deals. They were. So you can find out your like ancient, super ancient lines of ancestry, what they refer to as haplogroups, right? These are the different groups that you descended from over hundreds of thousands of years, right? And they can trace through your DNA the different haplogroups that you have basically evolved from. Starting from, like with both my parents, each one of your parents is going to come from a different haplogroup. Hopefully. And they can trace like the most recent haplogroup. Like my mom, I think there was like 10 haplogroups that she has come from, right? The first one starting in Africa, the second one in Africa. Like the first one started in Kenya, then they moved to the Sudan. Then those folks in the Sudan got tired of Africa and they bolted. They got out of there. They weren't in Africa all that long, like maybe 50,000 years, and they got out and they went straight to the Middle East. And they shot up to the Middle East, and then they blasted up to like what you would call modern day, like Georgia, Tbilisi area. They shot up there and then popped back down into the Middle East, and then kind of just bopped around the Middle East for the next 50, 60,000 years, or probably longer than that. But they got out of Africa pretty quick, right? But so her most recent haplogroup is K, right? But it evolved from all these different haplogroups, right? And each haplogroup is like a genetic group, right? That existed for a time and then migrated somewhere else and mingled with other people and became a new genetic group, right? A new haplogroup, which then migrated, mingled, became another haplogroup. And so that's kind of the genetic story. And so everybody's haplogroup story is going to be, a little different. And this can tell you something about, your genetic past, the journey that your genetic family has taken over, the last 100, 200,000 years. So that to me is very interesting. My mother's group, they got out of Africa fast. They went up to the Middle East. They went up to Georgia, then back down the Middle East, and just stayed in the Middle East. And then, the most recent haplogroup K becomes, pretty well established about 25,000 years ago or so. And from there, they end up migrating into Europe and spread all throughout Europe and parts of Asia. But haplogroup K is very prominent in Northwest Europe today. So that's kind of the genetic story of where her line sort of came from. Right? My father's group, however, started in the Cameroon area, where I think they believe all like mitochondrial atom or Y chromosome atom came from, and they believe he is like at this point the ancestor to uh, all men. He's the first ancestor. But anyway, that mitochondrial or Y chromosome atom existed about somewhere between 170 and 300,000 years ago. A little while. And there's a bit of a range there, and they're not exactly sure. But started in Cameroon, but then that group moved into what would be considered Chad, southern Chad. And anyway, my dad comes from haplogroup J2, right? But there were that, and his lineage consists of 11 haplogroups. And so he has 10 other haplogroups that led up to his group, right? Which became, haplogroup J2 came into existence around 15 to 20,000 years ago, kind of in the Middle East, like the Fertile Crescent, like Iraq, Iran area. But they, like all of us, started out in Africa. And that group started out in Cameroon, moved to Chad, then shot up to North Africa, to what might you call like Nigeria now, right? I don't know what was going on, but then they went all the way from North Africa, straight down, all the way down Africa to near, not quite the bottom, but like Southeast Africa, so all the way down. And then they shot back up and then out of Africa and in the Middle East. So when my mom's haplogroup, one of her haplogroups got out of there pretty early. They weren't in Africa for maybe 50, 60,000 years or something like that. My dad's haplogroups, the different haplogroups that my dad's line came from that were in Africa, like that line was all over Africa for over 100,000 years probably before they left the continent and went to the Middle East. Okay, but that's what they did. They were in Africa for a long time, all over. I don't know who was chasing them or what they were doing, right? Or if they were just following herds or what was going on, but they were all over that continent. It's a crazy migration line to look at. But anyway, they left. They go to the Middle East. All right, the different haplogroups that led to my father's J2 haplogroup. The haplogroup then goes into the Middle East, and then from there, straight across Iran and Pakistan into the heart of India, deep into the heart of India. Then it comes straight back the way it came, back to the Middle East, where they end up staying and where J2 eventually becomes prevalent around 20,000 years ago. And then J2, that haplogroup, the most recent haplogroup that my father's come from, spread throughout the Middle East, spread into the Caucasus mountains and into parts of Russia, and parts of, South Central Asia and parts of Southern Europe, and heavily into the Mediterranean, right? I mean, like I said, with my mom's haplogroup, that was in the Middle East, and then they end up migrating into Europe and become like one of the dominant haplogroups in Northwest Europe today. So that's kind of their migration pattern. But it was this pattern of tribes intermingling with other tribes, right? Becoming a new tribe, a new group, a new genetic group, right? These different groups all had different genetic markers and influenced each other. Different cultures change each other genetically, right? And we see this happening. You can see this happening like over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, right? Between Africa and the Middle East and everything. But you also see this too in more recent history, right? Just in the last couple thousand years. Like for example, ancient Germany was originally populated by Celts. Celts are the natives of what we would consider Germany today. What we consider the Germanic peoples that now populate Germany came from Scandinavia, right? The Celts ended up getting pushed by the Scandinavians. They got pushed out of out of Germany and out of the regions they were in, and pushed into other parts, and ended up in places like England and Ireland and even Spain, and throughout Europe and in France. But you see that in like British history, right? Is when you think of people think of British as just white, right? White, bone white people, but they're a fascinating, not just historically speaking, but genetically speaking. They're not just, they're a mix of different Celtic tribes and a whole bunch of different Germanic tribes and Scandinavian tribes, whether it be the Anglo-Saxons that had such a huge genetic impact, especially on England. And they found that, English people tend to have a higher level of Scandinavian traits, Scandinavian genes, than people that live in the other British Isles. But if you live in England, you tend to have higher Anglo-Saxon heritage. But you see that in Ireland too. Ireland was not just Celtic. They were conquered by the Normans. They were conquered by the Vikings. They've the British. If you're English, you probably have Roman and Italian ancestry in you too, because the Romans, had conquered England back around 400 AD or 400 CE, however you want to call it. So that's like I'm like 8% Italian or whatever. That probably comes from when the Romans controlled Europe and controlled England. So fascinating history, that nobody is just the simple things that they think you are. And from a health perspective, there is a lot that you can potentially learn about what types of things might be more harmful to you, what types of things might be beneficial for you diet-wise, allergy-wise, things like that. So it's an interesting way to learn about yourself, but also understand that there's a lot they're still learning. And just because they say that there's a probability that you're going to have this trait, doesn't necessarily make it so. It just means there's a probability. There's all these other factors, right? Like a genetic marker can indicate, let's say, a 90% probability that you're going to, have a bad temper or something like that. That there's all these other factors that also have an impact that may not be measured as of yet anyway, right? There may be other genetic factors that aren't being recorded yet that are having an impact on your behavior. Not to mention all the environmental factors that can have a huge influence on who you are and how you behave and how you choose to behave. Outside of just your genetic predisposition, but your environment and how you're raised can have a huge impact. And where you live, the resources that you have, right, the choices that you make, these things can make a huge difference. It's not all genetics, but it'll be interesting to see how much, as the years advance and things become a lot more precise in our understanding of human genetics and what that means as far as how much that really does determine, because it seems like it determines an awful lot. It may determine most everything, but it doesn't determine everything, right? Because there's too many things that happen in the world that can counter, right, or that can even support or enhance a genetic predisposition. Right. So just because you are probably predisposed to having a healthy BMI doesn't mean you will be if you're reckless. If you take that for granted, let's put it that way. If you take for granted that you're probably going to be good at math, and then you don't try to be good at math, you're probably not going to be as good at math as you could be, right? And maybe someone whose probability for not being good at math makes the effort may end up being better at math than the person with the genetic marker saying they would be good at it, but they didn't try, right? There's something to be said for what you try and what you do and what you let influence you, right? That's the other thing too. Let's talk about influences in the environment, right? We choose to some degree, we don't choose our environment, but to some degree we do. And we should think about what impacts we can have on our environment that are positive, right? That can have a positive impact on us, right? Because it's not all genetic. There are constantly environmental influences bombarding us that affect us, that we need to keep in mind when we're trying to make sense of ourselves, make sense of our past, and make sense of what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to live and choose, and how to move forward, right? So these are all interesting things you need to take into consideration. And that's why I like the CRI genetics approach with using the anthropologists, right? That they take a historical anthropological approach, and in their reports, they give you a nice breakdown of a lot of these different groups and their tribes. Each haplogroup that I talked about, and I only talked about a couple, but like I said, my mom came from 10, my dad came from 11 different haplogroups, right? They give you a nice little explanation about each one and some of the genetic research that's been done about them, and some of the historical and anthropological research that's come out about these different groups that lived, 10, 20, 50, 100,000 plus years ago, right? And give us a deeper sense of where we came from. Here's a weird piece of information. For example, my dad's most recent haplogroup, J2, for whatever reason, is highly associated. Most of the people that share that J2 lineage, right, have a history of bull worshiping, right? For whatever it is, throughout the Middle East, and you see it in Spain and even parts of France, the bullfighting. There's a lot of bull worshiping that went on around 15, 20,000 years ago. They really, really were into bulls. And apparently my dad's haplogroup really liked to travel. Where my mom's kind of stayed, they got out of Africa and then just kind of stayed kind of in this same rough general area of the Middle East for a long time. My dad's haplogroup was all over the place. They were all over Africa, and they went all the way over to India, and they came back. And I gotta wonder, it's these Chinese and Indian ancestors. I'm wondering if that was my father's side of the family with a bunch of British sailors in the 17 and 1800s. That's what I'm guessing. I really don't know. Don't have much information from that side of the family. Perhaps that's part of the reason why. Interesting family tidbit, just to tell you, my great grandfather on my father's side was a mercenary. And he did spend time in Asia and other places, far-flung places across the world, working for American companies as a mercenary, putting down, revolts and unrest by oppressed peoples. And he was a mercenary, and he owned a farm that my great grandmother ran, and he would just come home from wherever he was from fighting. He would come home, get her pregnant, take the money from the farm, and leave, and go on to his next assignment. Not a very nice man, apparently, but he liked to travel, and it seems perhaps that he's not the only one from my father's side of the family that liked to travel quite a bit. So there's some speculation there. Don't really know for sure what happened and how all that came to play, right? But it does seem like where the appearance of all the Asian ancestry occurred was kind of around the dominance of the British Empire. So it does seem to coincide. It would not be the wildest assumption to make that, yes, perhaps I had a number of generations of my family that were perhaps British sailors that ended up in India or China and ended up getting married to some of the local women there. That's totally possible, and I think that's actually really cool. I'm glad to know about that, and that makes me want to learn more about these people and more about their past. And I think that part of the reason I wanted to talk about this was to help spread the idea that this simplistic idea of, oh, I'm white or I'm Irish or I'm German Irish. No, you're not. You think you are, but it's a lot more complex than that, right? There's a lot more to what makes you you than you realize. And we all came from Africa originally, right? We were all black. Like 200,000 years ago, we were all black. It was only once the tribes started moving north, right? The ones that moved north got white, right? That's, but we all come from similar origins, and there's been a lot of intermingling, as you will see from your genetic report, right? You are not just French, you're not just European, you're not just, Italian, you're not just, whatever. You're a mixed bag, and your ancestors have been mixing and mixing and mixing for hundreds of millennia. And I think this is the healthy understanding that we need to have, especially within the United States, right? Which is supposed to be a melting pot. You'd think we'd understand it a little better. But we do have this white supremacy problem. We haven't gotten past yet. And I think having a more nuanced and mature understanding of our genetic history might help people. It'd be a lot harder to be a white supremacist if you know you're 3% African, right? It's a lot harder to hate people of color when you know that 10% of you is actually a person of color, that you come from that part of your genetic line is people of color, that you are not just a white dude. You're not just descended from Vikings and Celts. There's a lot more going on than just that. So that's kind of the short overview. I would definitely encourage you, to check it out, get a genetic test if you're interested. Like I said, your paranoia is not unfounded. I totally understand why people be hesitant to not want to have their genetic information out there, but like I said, I just had to do it. I just couldn't wait any longer. So hopefully that was interesting to you. Like I said, there's different packages, different companies, they have a different approach, right? Pick the one that you want. I like CRI. I thought they did a really nice job. They got different packages that you can choose from. They even have one where you can find out what famous celebrities you're related to. I didn't get that one, but there's the health and wellness, nutrition, allergies and stuff that could tell you all kinds of interesting things about what you might be allergic to, and different health information that might be relevant to you that you might want to take into consideration. What certain types of illnesses you might be more susceptible to, things like that. Now, if you want to take this really seriously, you want to meet with a real genetics counselor, a licensed genetics counselor that knows what they're talking about. Meet with them, meet with your doctor, take this, if you're going to be scientifically rigorous, then be scientifically rigorous, right? If you're going to get serious about it from a medical perspective, if you just want to think about your ancestry, no big deal. It's just a neat thing to think about and ponder. Well, I wonder where that came from. That's neat to think about. But if you're talking about medical decisions and things like that, you definitely want to involve your doctor. You definitely want to involve a licensed professional. This is not one of those things where you just, make it up on your own. Involve the scientists in any genetic decisions, any decisions you base off of your genetic code. Well, yeah, it's fascinating. Another interesting thing here too is that I was going to tell you about my mom's side, right? Is that the K haplogroup, right? For whatever reason, they've noticed a high proportion of centenarians in Italy and in, I think, China that belong to haplogroup K, and that live, well over 100 years old. And so they believe that perhaps there's something about there's some genetic marker with haplogroup K that is associated with good stress management and longevity. So that's the thing. They make a lot of associations, right? With this gene is associated with this. This gene is associated with that. But that's not the end of the story. We don't know how different genes interact with each other or how different genes interact under different environmental circumstances. So there's a lot still to learn, but it's fascinating. And I think it's something that, from an educational standpoint too, I think our schools, from a scientific, anthropological, historic perspective, the school system should start really focusing a lot more on genetics education and genetics, explaining the science behind it, right? And how they've come to understand, right, the human genome, right? But also explain how we came out of Africa and the different groups that migrated out of Africa at different times and went different places and then commingled over and over and over again into all sorts of different permutations over hundreds of thousands of years, and developed all these different cultures that would war and then intermingle and migrate, right? That creates this fascinating story, right? To just think that, well, I'm descended from Vikings, right? I'm descended from Vikings and from farmers. Well, that's kind of cool, and that's not inaccurate, but it's not untrue. But it's a very limited and very narrow understanding of your background when you realize that, oh wow, there's a lot more to my past than I realized. I had ancestors 900 years ago in South America I didn't even know existed. I had ancestors 300-400 years ago in Asia. No idea they ever lived and were a part of my story. What other mysteries about ourselves are undiscovered that we haven't even touched or scratched? The things that make you you or make me, right? Those hidden secrets. How many of those are hidden within your genome? I don't know. A lot. All of them? No, but a lot. There's a lot going on there, and a lot for us to learn. But we definitely need to proceed with caution and be smart about it. But I definitely think genetics education, understand the importance of genetics from a scientific perspective and a medical perspective, right? But also, it's like I said, to help people understand that, right, a more accurate understanding of who we really are, right? And that race is a myth. There is no white race. There is no black race. There is none of that. There's just the human race and all the different variations that have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years based on the environment that we were in, and we adapted to survive accordingly and continue to accordingly. So really, really fascinating stuff. I hope you enjoyed the talk about it. We do have another show coming up soon. This next episode is going to be about gun control. We're gonna wade into it. We've got a major gun problem since the country started to open back up. The shootings have started again. The mass shootings. We've had quite a few just in the last week or so, making it very clear that we have a very serious problem that isn't going away. It's only getting worse. And what are we going to do about it? So we're going to talk about gun control. What are the measures that might work? What won't work? What can get passed and what can't? Because there's a lot of stuff that just isn't going to pass. That might work. That might be a good idea, but it's just not going to get passed in Congress. So what do we do, realistically speaking? And what can we not do? We're going to talk about all of that and more. And so that's it for this episode of The Breakdown. I really enjoyed talking to you about it. Hopefully we can talk again real soon And I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye.